Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. The 15th day of the month of Shvat, commonly known as Tu B'Shvat, is the day on the Jewish calendar that marks the beginning of a new year for trees. The season in which the earliest blooming trees in the land of Israel emerge from their winter sleep and begin a new fruit-bearing cycle. There are a variety of agricultural laws that flow from Tu B'Shvat. In addition, we mark Tu B'Shvat by eating fruit, particularly fruit that are singled out by the Torah in its praise of the bounty of the Holy Land, Eretz Yisrael: grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. Tu B'Shvat has also become a time to reflect on our connection to nature more broadly through a religious lens. Who are we in the universe, and how do we connect to the wider universe? To that end, I invited my guest this week, Rabbi Dr. Elie Feder, who received his rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Yisrael Chait and has a PhD in mathematics from the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of Gematria Refigured, a new look at how the Torah conveys ideas through numbers, as well as Happiness in the Face of Adversity, powerful Torah ideas from a mom's parting words. He is also a co-host of the podcast Physics to God and the host of the podcast Simply Deep. Before we jump in, I just want to take a moment to also thank our mutual friend, Jonathan Siskovic, who made the connection, the cashier between us, to bring Rabbi Dr. Feder to us today. With that, Dr. Feder, welcome.
Welcome. Nice to meet you, Justin.
Nice to meet you as well. Yeah, that's our first time meeting. I'm thrilled to have you. I'm a little bit out of my element, which I'm excited about because I like to learn new things. That's part of the fun of this. But before we get into God's existence through the lens of physics, a couple questions. First, I've heard of Yeshiva B'nai Torah and Rabbi Chait, but I imagine many of our audience members have not. Can you just say a little bit about what that is and why it's a special place? I know that you received your ordination there and now also teach there.
Yes, great. So, by the way, you can call me Elie.
Okay, great. Elie.
So Rabbi, I learned, my father actually learned with Rabbi Chait many years ago, when Rabbi Chait started his yeshiva, maybe 50 years back or so. And I learned that Yeshiva B'nai Torah since I was 16 years old or so. So Rabbi Chait is my rabbi, and he taught me most of what I know and how to think. Specifically, I'd say, again, it's hard to say about it one person, and a lot about one person, but I'd say two things which he taught me, which are especially meaningful to me. And one is he taught me Gemara for many years. And Gemara he teaches, he's a student of the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and of Rav Moshe Feinstein, but he learned his method of learning called the Brisker Derech, which is an analytic method of learning Torah. And they really feel like Rabbi Chait has taught me how to learn Torah, how to learn Gemara specifically, in an analytic, thoughtful way. And it really, his teaching has given me the tools to be able to analyze areas like physics or like biology or like just the world, philosophy, psychology, just the tools of, he teaches Gemara in a way which brings out how Torah, how learning Talmud, Gemara trains a person to be able to think about the world in general. So that's one thing I learned, which is especially thankful to him for that. And another thing which I guess he taught me and is, I guess, characteristic of the way he teaches, that oftentimes people look at Torah and the worldly knowledge as almost like a contradiction between the two. And they kind of wear one hat when they study Torah, and where they kind of just believe in things no matter what they sound like. And then they wear another hat when they study science or psychology or they go out into the world. And Rabbi Chait kind of showed us, brought out how the Torah really holds that's not the case. There's really a synergy between one's Torah learning and one's worldly knowledge. And the lens of the analysis that we do and that I've always learned from him is always trying to justify, to show that there's no conflict between Torah and between science and between the knowledge of the world. And he's kind of just given me the tools to be able to, and also me the tools to be able to deal with modernity, with the challenges that sometimes modernity poses to people who are trying to study Torah, and balance it with the questions which come up in the modern world.
Beautiful. And I'll say, first of all, as someone who's interested in Musar and Jewish character development, it's also a core idea that we look to the Chokhmat HaOlam, as Rabbi Yisrael Chait calls it, the wisdom of the world, to enhance our service of God, our Jewish practice, those things, not as something in contradiction.
Yes,
so
definitely.
that heavily relates. I'll ask it in a weird way, and hope this makes sense, but, I've heard people kind of use language like, "Oh, he's a Chaity," he's a Chaity, that kind of thing. People who are from this school of thought, within, let's call it the modern Orthodox world, let's say, how would someone who studied at this yeshiva with Rabbi Chait look or act differently? What are the ways that's like, oh, this is a little bit different? It's obvious that's a Chaity. Can you give me an example of that?
It often might mean someone who's trying to make sense of the world, and I guess we don't really. Like something which might have a mystical, magical, superstitious type of a sound. And he's kind of trying to bring out the wisdom of the Torah and the wisdom as it would be seen through a modern, scientific-minded lens.
Beautiful.
And in that sense.
Like grounded in rational thinking.
Yeah, it's grounded.
It's not about the leap of faith. It's about actually doing the diligence understanding.
And the mitzvahs, through the commandments which you perform, should make sense and appeal to the rational faculty and to see the beauty and the wisdom in everything which we do. But not just in some esoteric sense that we kind of have to just believe it, and therefore it just, we kind of talk the language. At the same time, no, it has to make sense and resonate to the rational mind. And the same rational mind which we use when we study Gemara, everyone studies Gemara using rational, clear thinking and categories. And
sure.
So too when we study philosophy, psychology, science, is the same type of, the Torah should talk to our mind, and that's often perhaps what's meant by that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. And tell me a little bit, you've had this interesting dual path where you got a PhD in math and also got smicha, became a rabbi, and even in your day-to-day now, you're spending half the day teaching Torah and half the day teaching mathematics at a college. How do you develop that interest, and what's that like? Yeah.
Right. Okay, good question. So I guess it's part of my upbringing. My grandfather got smicha, got ordination from the Rav, Rabbi Yisrael Chait, and he was a chemist. My father is also a rabbi, and he's a lawyer. And so I was brought up in a home, basically, which had a strong emphasis on serious Torah learning, but also serious involvement with the world. Mm-hmm. And as the kid, I was always like that math whiz in class, so I was that annoying kid who always got the answers, So it was just natural for me to pursue a path of studying math in an advanced way. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I also valued Torah very strongly. And so it was like a natural, actually when I went to MTA for high school, and the rabbi there, who actually lives on my block now, he was a rabbi and a math teacher. And it kind of inspired me to I could do that, I could kind of bridge the two, and then I ended up going, he's a high school math teacher, I ended up going for a PhD, and I ended up, I'm a math professor, so I do math research, but at the same time, I feel like my passion is with Torah. And,
right.
But it's nice to be able to bridge the two and take the knowledge from Torah and the knowledge from the world and integrate them to a coherent whole.
Beautiful, great. And I also find that very moving in trying to do both. And I know a lot of the greats, literature and Torah, math and Torah, so it's cool to be able to be drawing from multiple disciplines and bring them together. So that, I guess that'll bring us to kind of the small or really big question, and kind of how your background has informed that, which is, I know you've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about the relationship between physics, intelligent cause, the creation of God, God's existence. So let's just start with the simple question. Does God exist?
Does God exist?
Yes.
Okay.
And again, as you've laid out from where you're sitting, this is not something you feel. This is something that you want to base in science and the world around us.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, great. Okay, good question. So I guess the people often, continuing from that same conversation, people often have this dichotomy, and they think about it as that God exists because I feel like he does, and medicine works because I know that it does. Mm-hmm. And you kind of relate to, and business investments are good because I know. And there's like this analytic part of your mind, which analyzes the world and investigates the world through intelligence. But then kind of when it comes to God, either there's just like a belief, or sometimes people have like doubts and skeptical doubts. Is it really true? Well, I guess I'll just believe it and I'll move on with my life. And that works for some people. Mm-hmm. Some people are just happy and they blind faith and they totally fully embrace the existence of God. And if that works for them, great. But there are other people who they feel the conflict. They feel the challenges and they feel the perplexity. Is on the one hand, I look at the world and I navigate the world using my mind in certain rational categories. And then God just almost feels make-believe. It almost feels like Smurfs or like Star Wars, and And I think that oftentimes leads people to have deep crises, if you will. And it works for some points, but there's a part of a person that has a hard time embracing Torah because they have these doubts. Mm-hmm. And I think it's largely fueled by the modern world, the atheists of the world, Richard Dawkins of the world, Stephen Hawking of the world, who say that God is dead. You got to be crazy to believe in God, the God delusion. That's kind of, the atheists want you to think, scientists want you to think that God is this antiquated, ancient idea. And insofar as we respect scientists in this world, it creates a conflict for people. People feel like, oh, so I respect scientists, I take medicine, I get surgery, but at the same time I know doctors and I know scientists think stuff is make-believe. Mm-hmm. So what I and the chavrusa of mine, Rabbi Aaron Zimmer, we've kind of discovered over the past 15 years or so that modern science actually points to the existence of God. And there's something called fine-tuning, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but there's recent discoveries over the past decades, which directly leads to the existence of God. And this is what our podcast, Physics to God, is a culmination of 12 or 13 years worth of working on this argument. We basically show how this thing called fine-tuning, which we'll talk about, indicates that science points towards the existence of God. So much so, the only way, there's this evidence of fine-tuning, the only way to get around this evidence, the only way that scientists, rational, atheistic scientists explain away this thing called fine-tuning is by positing, this is going to sound strange, a multiverse, an infinite multiverse, infinitely many parallel universes, kind of like on Spider-Man or the things which sounds like science fiction. But these are scientists, the top scientists in the world are all starting to believe in the existence of infinitely many parallel universes where anything and everything possible happens. And that's the only other option. The only other way to explain this thing called fine-tuning is to posit this infinite multiverse. So these are scientists who are believing this. And what we try to show is that if scientists are believing in an infinite multiverse, because this fine-tuning is a real thing. And fine-tuning points directly towards the existence of God. And multiverse is like this make-believe, science fiction-y type of a theory. And that's kind of what we try to talk about on our podcast.
Okay, so let me make sure I got it all, and then let's start breaking this down.
Okay.
So I hear you saying that kind of the rise of science has kind of said, if you believe in science, you can't believe in God. The natural assumption is kind of like, you need to do away with the God thing. It makes no sense. The real thinkers, the science people, think differently. I would add, I think parallel to that, I'm not a historian, but I think also the Holocaust. I would say like the Holocaust and like how bad that was, I think was a big knock against the existence of God, and then the rise of science for sure. And I hear you saying not only should science not be a knock on God, but actually if you look to science and you look to the discoveries that have been coming out over the previous decades, it's actually pointing towards the existence of God. Yes. And then I hear you adding a third piece, which is where science points towards God, and now people who are trying to say, I don't know if they're motivated by proving that God doesn't exist, or this is what they're discovering, but there's a different, perhaps an alternative that might actually not line up with that, is the idea of a multiverse, which we'll have to unpack as well, which maybe in that world, maybe there's evidence pointing towards there not being an existence of God. Although perhaps that one also in 20 years from now we'll realize actually multiverse proves there is God. Who knows? But let's see. We'll get up to that. All right, sorry, let's start unpacking that for me. How does science prove God? And you mentioned fine-tuning a few times. I assume we're going to start there.
Yeah, we'll start there. Okay. Yeah. So we'll actually start before fine-tuning.
Great.
Which is that, what does physics do? Physics is looking to understand, science as a whole, but physics specific, is looking to understand what makes our universe work. What are the underlying principles, laws, which govern everything about our universe. And we see diverse phenomenon around us, from the stars and from this mug and from everything, from our cell phones. And what are the laws that ultimately make it all tick? And that's what physics is looking for. And physics is looking to take the complexities of the world and reduce it to simpler and simpler and simpler components. That's the goal. Scientists are looking for something called a unified theory, a theory of everything, if you will. Trying to understand, and they've been very successful at trying to understand the basic laws of our universe.
So for example, gravity. Right?
Gravity, yes. Gravity in a more sophisticated way is like general relativity, which is gravity comes under that, but yeah.
So two things. Like you're saying, like a broader rule is the idea of relativity, and then like a rule in our universe is because we live on planet Earth.
expresses
itself through gravity.
Yeah.
And so physics is trying to have an understanding of the rules behind the game that we're all living in.
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
Great.
And they've got it down, basically, very successful. So physics gotten to the point where basically you got general relativity and you got quantum mechanics, without going into those at all.
But the first one was general relativity, you said?
What
was the first one called?
General relativity, or you call it relativity, and quantum mechanics.
Those are the two big...
Those are the two laws which they're trying to unify and make them into one. They don't know how to do that, but they're really explaining everything follows from these two sets of laws. Okay. But there's a catch.
Okay.
Besides these two laws, which are these beautiful mathematical laws.
Can I trouble you to give me a sentence on each of them just to give a little bit more scaffolding? I know they're whole fields.
Yeah.
But what does general relativity?
I guess general relativity relates to the space-time. It's like the relationship, the theory which is about the relationship of items within space and time. And quantum mechanics is like the interrelationship of interactions of the fundamental particles which our universe is made of. So like electrons, electrons that repel. That's like based on the laws of quantum mechanics are, the laws which are govern the interaction of the fundamental particles.
Why don't they go together?
Well, they end up being a contradiction when you get down to certain, like at the beginning of our universe, and like they end up having this conflict between those two laws that they end up leading to contradictions. And
if you go back to the beginning,
okay. I don't know if that's the only place, but they're situations where they can't quite work the two together.
Okay.
And that's what they're looking for. The dream of physicists is there's something called Dreams of a Final Theory. It's a book by Steven Weinberg. That's the idea, is they're hoping to find one law that will explain everything.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, keep going.
Okay, now within these laws, they're doing great. They got these two laws, hopefully it could become one. But they also have these numbers, quantities. There are 25 or so numbers. You have these two beautiful laws, but you have 25 numbers. Like, there's something called the fine structure constant. It has to do with the strength of electromagnetic force. And the number is 1 over 137.035999139, something like that.
Okay.
And this is a fundamental number that's baked into our universe. There's nothing
like anywhere you look, you find that.
Every electron that you look at, if you want to measure how strongly it interacts with another electron, it's determined by this number.
Okay.
Or another number is something called the cosmological constant. This is the rate at which the universe is expanding, or accelerating. And the number is 0.0000000, 120 zeros, and it's followed by 3. Okay. And that's the rate that the universe is expanding.
Cool.
There are 25 or so numbers that are these unwieldy, ridiculous numbers. And that's an anathema to scientists. They're trying to explain everything in beautiful laws. But then the two laws are beautiful. The qualitative nature of these laws are beautiful. But then you got these 25 ugly, unwieldy numbers. And they're trying to explain, how do you explain a number? You could explain phenomena in our universe, but at the core, you got these ugly numbers. And Richard Feynman was one of the greatest physicists of the previous generation.
I remember, surely you must be joking, Mr. Feynman.
Yeah, exactly.
I read that book at some point. I love that book.
It's funny,
it's great. He's a funny guy.
Yeah, very funny guy.
Okay.
So he's also a great scientist. He's a really funny guy and a character, but one of the greatest scientists of yesteryear.
Okay.
So he called this one of the greatest mysteries of, the greatest damn mystery of physics, something like that.
These numbers.
And how do you explain these numbers?
To clarify, the problem with these numbers, the word ugly doesn't clarify well enough. Is that they don't fit in nicely to these larger equations, and they're just like these unique numbers that don't have any relationship. If they all ended in 3 or something, then we would know something.
Exactly. It would be like, for example, imagine just to take like a Torah example. So let's say we tithe, we give 10% of, the law of charities, you give 10%. Imagine the law where you give 13.0317426%.
Right.
It's like
we'd be like, what's the story there?
Yeah, what's the deal with that? Well, how do you explain that? Now, you could just not say we don't explain anything, but science explains things. That's science's job to explain things. But at the core, you got these numbers, which they know these numbers because they measure them. Right. There's no theory that could explain them. And science wants to explain things. Right. And the mystery Feynman is saying, how do we explain it? So every physicist should put this number up on his wall and wonder about it. It's almost like the hand of God wrote this number. Now, he was an atheist, so he's not. There's nothing which points to God. It's this mystery. Right. And this mystery was in 1985 in a book QED. This was before what he even knew about this thing called fine-tuning. There's nothing to do with fine-tuning, which we may not know what it is yet anyway, so don't worry. But this on its own has nothing to do with God. It wouldn't be reasonable to say, this number is that number because God made it that way.
No.
That doesn't explain anything. Why would you say that? It just sounds like a random, crazy number.
Right.
At that point, no one would say God. Everyone just says it's a mystery.
Right. And I'll just pause there for a second to say I know that the scientific world is like, what do we do with these numbers? But it's also very impressive that they've figured out these numbers.
Yes.
Just as a side note,
Yes,
as a non-scientist who's not in it, and then we go past that, but they know the universe is expanding by 120 zeros with a 3 at the end. Like, who did that?
Unbelievable.
That's
that was the
unbelievable.
discovery in 1998. And this was a discovery, we'll see this thing called fine-tuning. It was shocked physicists. But it's unbelievable, the knowledge that got to the point that we know these numbers.
It's unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Okay, fine. All right, keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just feel like I needed to pause for Hakarat Tov to say recognition.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Now then they discovered,
Yeah.
again, over in the 80s and again, culminated in 1998. We'll talk about that one, in 1998 discovery. Not only, there's something special about these numbers. We didn't think there was something special. Feynman thought they were just random, arbitrary numbers.
Right.
But it was discovered that these numbers were fine-tuned. Like it's almost like an analogy of like a radio station. You turn the dial to exactly the right amount. And what that means is that this cosmological constant, if it were higher, the universe would be expanding. The early universe would expand too fast that you wouldn't have any galaxies forming. If it was smaller or was negative, it would crush too quickly that you wouldn't be able to also form any galaxies. And all these numbers, there's 25 or so numbers, there are many examples. 5, 10, 15 examples of fine-tuning, which basically shows these numbers are necessary. And if they weren't, like this on 1 over 137.0355999, it's not as random as Feynman thought. But if the number were off by a small percentage, then you wouldn't have stable atoms, and then you wouldn't have stable molecules, and you wouldn't be able to have planets and stars and life.
Not only would Earth not exist with life, the entire...
No complexity, no structure, no atoms. You wouldn't have any stable atoms. You wouldn't have any carbon, you wouldn't have hydrogen. In the galaxy.
Okay.
All you would have is a bunch of electrons and the quarks and fundamental particles banging around doing their crazy dance.
Got it.
Nothing structured, ordered. Nothing with life even.
Right.
Life, you wouldn't have life for sure, but you wouldn't have a rock. You wouldn't have a planet, you wouldn't have a star. You just have electrons and fundamental particles banging around.
And these 25 numbers each need to be tuned perfectly.
I don't know that every single one of them, but yeah, there's many examples within these fundamental numbers that if they weren't to be tuned perfectly, you wouldn't have any order, structure, complexity, anything beautiful, anything amazing, anything you could think about which is even interesting is totally dependent upon these numbers being fine-tuned.
Okay.
And that is amazing. That's a clue. Feynman's mystery was, how in the world do you explain numbers? Well, wow. There's something special about these numbers. They're not crazy numbers. It's not just 13.36745%. It would be as if we would discover that if that wasn't the rate of charity, then society would fall apart. If the charity were more than 13%, rich people wouldn't work because they'd use all their money. They wouldn't be worth it for them. And if they were too little, then poor people would rebel. It would be as if you discover...
setting the interest rate or something.
Yeah, exactly. And if you discover, it would be as if you were to discover that the number has to be within that small range, that the charity amount is within that small range, otherwise society would fall apart.
Right.
And then you'd be like, oh my gosh, who
picked these numbers?
Who picked these numbers? And you might say, well, they just got lucky. Just got lucky, they're exactly fine. And maybe 13, you could say they just got lucky. But 13.1035726, it's just the specificity. And this is why the cosmological constant was the 120 decimal spots, 10 to the negative 120th power. That was, the degree of fine-tuning was such that even physicists, even atheists, they said there's no way that could be chance. You can't explain a number like that by pure chance.
Wow.
How in the world could you explain the specificity that's necessary to get the number exactly that way, without which we wouldn't have a universe, we wouldn't have anything. And everyone, atheists and theists alike, acknowledge this. This is scientific facts. The question is, how do you interpret it?
Right.
That was the question.
Okay. And just to make sure I'm with you here still, the idea is we have two theories. We're trying to have everything fit under one rubric. We have two theories that are in conversation but don't work perfectly together. We also have these 25 numbers. And what's emerged from the 25 numbers is the idea of fine-tuning, which is saying that unless those numbers are finely tuned, maybe not all of them, but some of them, there is no galaxy as we know it. And so we need to solve for who set the dials or something, or how the dials were set in such perfect ways.
Yes.
Great.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Next step,
Yeah.
which might seem obvious, but the natural interpretation of that is there's an intelligent cause. Intelligence is the ability to select one value or design over all the other possibilities. Select it in a way which will result in a whole much greater than the sum of its parts. That's a mark of intelligence. And if you see that the mystery finds mystery, what caused these values? Well, the answer is what caused them is something which there's a purpose of these values. And that indicates that the values are not what scientists are looking for. Normally scientists explain things by something that's called efficient causes, by the laws which generate these numbers in the past. Here, what causes these numbers is the future purpose of what they will result in. The cause of these numbers is these numbers are special because they are necessary to bring about this unstructured, complex universe. And that indicates an intelligent cause. That what we call God set these numbers because he wanted to bring about a universe like our own, the unbelievable, amazing, complex universe. He knew, so to speak, that if the numbers weren't precisely within this small range, you wouldn't have a beautiful universe. And therefore, the precision of these numbers is indicative that they were set by an intelligent cause. Much like in that case of a society, if the charity rate were 13.137462, and we'd show how the society would only work in that small range, we'd say, they were geniuses. Whoever designed, the economists who designed that law, that's unbelievable.
Right.
So that's where it points naturally. And that's what we spend season 1 of our Physics to God, is basically getting more into the nitty-gritty of that and making concrete the argument and spelling it out, and 2 other arguments, similar arguments. But that's basically the first part of our.
And what is someone who doesn't believe? You said it's open to interpretation. What's the theory for someone who does not believe in God?
Okay. So the only other game in town, so to speak, is a multiverse.
Got it. Okay. Wait, but before they even get to multiverse, someone before bringing up a multiverse would say that based on this, there has to be a God?
That's the only other, right, exactly. It's saying is the numbers, you have this mystery. We've found the clue to this mystery. The mystery is that the numbers are specifically those values which produce our universe.
Right.
That points to God. Now, obviously, scientists think about God as this antiquated belief system, which is nonsense and childish and whatever, and therefore they aren't willing to even consider God as an actual possibility. They say it's like an assumed premise that God doesn't exist.
Right.
So, but now they're stuck. Now what do they do?
Right, because they can't, it's too crazy to be like, it's just
happens
an amazing coincidence that happened to make the universe.
Yes.
And we're so lucky because of that crazy coincidence.
Right, in one universe, if there's only one universe, everyone would say that has to be that God.
Got it. So so then the idea is there must be more than one universe.
Yes.
And we're in the one that it works.
Exactly. There are infinitely many universes. And in one universe, it's exactly 1 over 137.03951999. In another universe, it's 17. In another universe, it's pi. In another, it's a billion. In another universe, all these numbers, infinitely many universes, parallel universes, where these numbers are different in the different universes. And if you really have an infinite number of universes and the numbers are different in each one, by chance alone, somebody's got to be in the universe where it's 1 over 137.
Right.
And it might as well be us. And the people on that universe are going to look around and say, hey, why are we in that universe? Well, if you aren't in that universe, then you wouldn't be here to talk about it, and that's called like an observer bias.
Got it. Wait, all right, so I have questions. So I didn't realize this. So the multiverse idea is that there are multiple parallel universes, but ours is the only one that, quote unquote, works, for lack of a better term.
I mean, there's infinitely many of them like ours, but
possible there could be another one out there that has everything fine-tuned? No.
Yes.
Oh,
There's going to be infinitely many of them. Turns out, they say this, in an infinite multiverse, everything possible happens, and it happens infinitely many times. So the sea splits. And they believe this. The physicists believe that the sea splits in infinitely many universes. Everything possible happens. I could just pick up this glass, and then next thing you know, it's going to be in your hand in some universe. There's quantum mechanics allows for these things. Everything possible happens infinitely many times. So there will be infinitely many universes. They actually believe this, where the numbers are right. There are infinitely many universes where the numbers are wrong.
Because once we're in an infinite
universe, everything happens.
Infinite.
Yeah, there's a universe where there's a voice that comes down from Mount Sinai and says, I am God, I created this universe, there's no such thing as a multiverse, it's all make-believe. And they're going to say, oh, well, that's just a chance. We happen to be in the one universe where there's a sound wave that happens to produce that, but that's not God. They can explain anything and everything by an infinite universe where anything possible happens. This is what the top scientists believe this. It's not science fiction. This is current modern scientists are believing this because there's no other game in town. It's either this or God.
It's either this or God. So it sounds like you're ascribing to them a little bit of a motive, a kind of like a...
Yeah, but they say this. They say this. This is one of their proofs. One of their proofs of God not exist, or of a multiverse is because how else you can explain these numbers.
And are there people that are God believers that also believe in the multiverse?
Well, it depends what you mean by multiverse. This is where we get into season 2. With multiverse, what we mean by multiverse is infinitely many randomly distributed chaotic universes. And that's like God, to say God created chaos and randomness and nonsense just to happen to get lucky one time. That's not wisdom. That's not...
Right.
So if you believe in a wise God, so to speak, that's like total... Yeah, it's unintelligent. That's just total... The God of the multiverse is, so to speak, a stupid God. In that sense. But,
right, so say that. So for someone who believes in the multiverse, we still have the cause question. What is their theory for how the multiverse was caused?
Oh, so that they just say there are these laws of nature. Like, how would we say God is caused? They say God just exists. Right? So they'll say the laws of physics just exist, and the multiverse just exists.
Always have been, always will be.
Always have been, always will be, spewing out new universes, big bangs all over the place, infinite many universes which are happening to exist. And some of them are going to be chaotic. Most of them are going to be chaotic. Some of them are going to happen to have this, semblance of fine-tuning, which is all just a big illusion. No God, no anything. But this is just the be-all and end-all of our universe. Infinitely many universes. So it's either one unbelievable universe created by one God, or infinitely many chaotic universes with no God. And these are the choices.
And we happen to live in one of the ones that's functioning. One of the infinite number that are functioning.
Exactly.
Got it. And so I'm hearing in the way you're describing it, skepticism towards the multiverse.
Yes, skepticism. But again, I think anyone should, I would assume our listeners would be skeptical of this. This sounds like bonkers a little bit, unscientific. These are the scientists who are saying, you believe in religion, you believe in miracles, how could you believe in such a thing? Well, they believe in infinitely many universes that have miracles. They believe in, it's like their whole high ground of saying is you can't believe in these things because they sound like nonsensical. They're believing in much crazier things than universes, infinitely many universes. But despite the fact that it sounds crazy, we're not just saying it sounds crazy and therefore it's wrong. In season 2 of God, Physics to God, we get into the weeds and we deal with that. They don't just say it, they claim that there are supports for it, and we take their supports very seriously, and we show how ultimately, even accepting all their premises, it leads to something called the measure problem. We're not getting into it, but basically shows the whole thing doesn't work. And that's what we get into in a very rigorous way.
Multiverse doesn't work.
Multiverse doesn't work. It's not a good theory. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain fine-tuning. It doesn't explain anything. It ultimately fails. And that's what we get into, showing that. So again, you may intuitively sense that that's a nonsense theory. I'd rather believe in one universe with one God than infinitely many and chaos. But we give them the benefit of the doubt and take it very seriously and work it through. And Now they also would say, someone may say, yeah, but your theory isn't good either. Right? Multiverse sounds crazy, but God also sounds crazy, the scientist will say. Mm-hmm. And that's what we haven't yet to do this, but season 3 of our podcast will be getting into what do we mean by God and how do we answer the questions that people ask on God. Who designed God? Who fine-tuned God? What does God even mean? And so this is what we're going to get into, is that we're going to study we're going to show how the way you think about fundamentals of our universe, if we take the categories that physics uses to think about fundamentals, we could use those same categories to think about God and to show, of course, God isn't a fundamental particle or anything, but we'll show how you could think about God in a rational way that could be formulated in a clear, compelling manner, which answers and avoids all the questions which people raise on God. So we have yet to do that. We're going to do that in season 3.
So can I get a sneak preview here? I think that's like the next question that comes up for me also is, then what is God, or what do you believe God to be? Okay. Again, not coming from a place of imagination, but from a place of science, from your approach. Yeah. Okay,
so just in short, again, I'll tell you in short, but stay tuned for season 3. Sure. And it may sound hard to relate to or to grasp or abstract, but at the same time, this is the way, like our Rishonim, the traditional medieval commentaries, thought about God. But God is one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, God is Hashem. God is our Lord, is God. Our Lord is one. God is one, simple, without any parts. He's non-physical. He doesn't have any parts whatsoever. And the idea that He's the cause, because what God does, He's the cause. He acted intelligently. He's caused our universe to exist. But He Himself is one, he's simple, he doesn't have any parts. And the idea of who designed God, you can't ask who designed something which has multiple parts. You say, well, who arranged those parts? Who fine-tuned his parts and set the numbers right? God is simple, he's one, he doesn't have any parts. And therefore that question of who designed God, who fine-tuned God, simply doesn't exist. So the Torah idea of God, we call it Yichud Hashem, the oneness, unity of God, that concept of God is what science is pointing towards. And this is what science sees, that as the pursuit of knowledge leads towards simpler and simpler and simpler existences. At the base of everything is God, one simple existence who created it all.
Beautiful. 2 questions on that. The first is, you alluded to this, but it's important to raise, I think, as well, that the relationship between science and God is not a new question. Right, this is something that goes back.
Yes.
You mentioned medieval. Just say a word about that. That kind of like, what is the long-term conversation that's had here? Yeah.
Right. So I guess there's, for example, in the count of mitzvos. Let's say the Rambam, Maimonides counts mitzvos. The first commandment is to know that God exists, and that presumably means that a person might believe that God exists from tradition, and that's a great source of knowledge based upon what he receives from his fathers, from his authorities. But at the same time, there's a mitzvah, a commandment to pursue that further, to understand it in a deeper way. And there's a book called Chovos Levavos, Duties of the Heart, which tries to present arguments. And there's a rich literature throughout our history is trying to see, to take our belief in God, which we inherit from our authorities, and to each person on their level to try to see it for themselves and to try to wrap their head around it and relate to God as real, as same way you relate to, your cell phone as real or medicine as real, to relate to God as real. And he's not make-believe, and he's not Spider-Man. He's the reality of realities, the fundamental of fundamentals. So there's a rich history of trying to see God and see the existence of God through rational argumentation. And this is the kind of, we think modern science furnishes a great example and a great path for a person to do so.
Beautiful. And then, and I have 2 more questions. Touch on the area of like creation/evolution and religion as well. 'Cause I think, that was certainly, I guess, like a hot topic. I don't know if it's as hot as it was anymore, but like this idea of squaring evolution with religion. It used to kind of be this thing like, choose you. You believe in the Bible or you believe in evolution. Say a little bit about that. Okay, great. So I guess there's a statement put out by the RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, I think it was in 2005, that basically said that, the wording was, I don't remember the exact wording, basically said it's like there's a long history of Jewish beliefs that the theory of evolution could be squared away with the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Basically saying is that there is no one might think evolution poses a problem with religion, with God, with the Torah, but it doesn't. Now, why? Right? So I guess the question is, what about evolution would one think would question the Torah, and then why doesn't it? Right? Okay. So I guess there's a few things. The world wasn't created in 6 days. Yes. Yeah, okay. Good. So that's one thing, right? The world wasn't created in 6 days. Yeah. So, yeah, the plain. If you just read Genesis 1 and 2, Bereshis, Aleph and Beis, it doesn't sound like a physics textbook, right? It just looks like God created the world in 6 days, and He took a man and the rib, and Adam and Eve, and all. The whole story. It just doesn't sound like it, and it seems like a disconnect between the plain reading of the verses of the Torah and what science tells us, right? So we could start with that, I guess. I think there's 3 questions people have, but we could start with that one. Would you say them? So what are the 3?
Okay, so that's one problem is that the plain reading of the Torah doesn't seem to be in line with science.
Okay. Where are the dinosaurs?
Other one is what?
Where are the dinosaurs?
Where are the dinosaurs, exactly, right. The other one is the man from monkeys bet. That evolution would suggest that man evolved from monkeys, and it doesn't. Besides the fact that that's not in line with the plain reading of the Torah, it also threatens the importance of man. Are we just overgrown monkeys? And if it doesn't, that question, religious people don't like that idea that we are just basically another form of an animal, and we think man is somehow unique and distinct from the rest of the biological world. And evolution points in the fact that no, we're just another link in the chain of evolution. Sure. And I guess the third one, which we kind of talked about, third problem is that we have a long history of people showing how the complexities of life point to a designer, point to God. Mm-hmm. And evolution kind of like, this is called, there's a book called The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, which basically says, there's this famous thing that William Paley, who's like a Christian theologian, he basically says, if you look at a watch, imagine you found the watch and you'd say, oh, that watch just came about by pure chance. You'd say, that's crazy, obviously there's a watchmaker. So Richard Dawkins says a book called The Blind Watchmaker. He says that the laws of evolution are blind. That's a blind watchmaker. They're basically the laws lead to the emergence of the diversity of life, purely based upon evolution. Mm-hmm. And that's a question on, you told us, religionists, you told us that there's no way to have design without an intelligent designer. Well, it turns out it's not true. Look at evolution. And that, I think, is what we're trying to do in Physics to God, is to show all of biology, that's in biology, but all of biology only works because the laws of physics at the root of the whole universe are fine-tuned and designed. And therefore, you think, in a certain sense, God set the laws of the universe so that the blind watchmaker could blindly make watches. It's like the laws of evolution are totally dependent upon design and physics. So we think that ultimately evolution doesn't remove the need for God, it just pushes it further back. So that's, I guess, the third.
So then the third one we've addressed a little bit. So let's get after the 6 days of creation and the dinosaur problem, and then we'll go to the monkey and man problem.
Yes, perfect. Okay. So the first thing has to do with how we relate to the plain reading of the text of the Torah. Okay, and there's a long history of, like, for example, the Torah says the hand of God. But we know it's a long-standing tradition. God doesn't have a hand. Right? God isn't physical. He doesn't have a body, and he doesn't have a hand. And therefore, we know that that's a metaphor. The hand is like a person's hand is like his might, his power. And the hand of God hit the Egyptians means like the power of God.
Sure.
Metaphor. So, it's a metaphor, exactly, right. And there's a Rashba, Rosh ben Adaras, who's a 13th century great rabbi, a Spanish rabbi. He says something, it's the way of our pious people than our religion. That whenever we find something in philosophy, which there was natural philosophy, whatever, science, which goes against the plain reading of a verse in the Torah, then we interpret the verse in a metaphorical way. And there's a similar, one example of that is Nachmanides, also a 13th century Spanish rabbi. He has this, the plain verse in the Torah says, after the flood, right? So God says, he made it the rainbow. And it says, I placed the rainbow, Eskashti nasadi be'anan, I placed the rainbow in the cloud, right? And Ramban says, if you just read that verse, you would say that when was the rainbow created? Right after the flood. But we know, due to the Greek scientists, that once you have water and light, and the raindrop will split the light up and it'll create a rainbow. And because we know that scientifically, against our will, we have to accept what the scientists tell us and interpret the verse in a non-literal way. When it says, I placed the rainbow in the cloud, it means the rainbow which I created previously at the 6 days of creation, now I placed it into the cloud and it will serve as a treaty. So there's evidence that, for this Ramban, is that the Torah is not always written in a way that the words are literal. And sometimes the Torah is written in allegories and metaphors. And when science points to shows that the plain reading of a verse is not true, is not possible, then we interpret allegorically. And there's a long tradition that especially the Maaseh Bereshis, the beginning of the Torah, is not meant to be a science textbook. And it's writing to us in a way that man can understand it. But obviously creation is a deep area with lots of esoteric ideas and truths. And the Torah, like the Rambam talks about this, is that, Maimonides talks about that, it was written in a way that we should know that the world was created and everything around us was created by God, but at the same time it's not meant to be literal. So the account of creation in the Torah, it says 6 days, but day, oftentimes day, for example, doesn't mean 24-hour period. Day sometimes means the 40 years in the desert, or day in Pasuk, a verse in Hosea is referring to the period of the first temple. Day oftentimes means a period of time. And the Torah is describing to us the universe unfolded in a period of stages. There are stages, eras, if you will, that the universe unfolded. And it's not meant to be a precise scientific history of the world as much as it alludes to different ideas. And therefore, if science discovers that it's not literally as described in the first 2 chapters of the Torah, well, we never thought those 2 chapters were a little description of the thing. So a day doesn't mean a day, it can mean billions of years. And the sequence of events, Adam being created from the dirt, doesn't necessarily mean that there was dirt was created, but like in a certain sense, the Rambam has this metaphor, because for example, the 6 days of the world, there's a Ramban and Nachmanides and the Ran, Rabbi Nissan, he says that the world was created really in one shot and it unfolded. So even though the plain reading of the verses implies that it was created in 6 separate phases, but there's a long history that the Torah is not meant to be interpreted literally. So therefore the point,
So it's a metaphor. Don't take it literally. I think I've also heard other people say that, but actually, if you look at the stages sequentially, they're not so far apart from what did happen in history. So there is something happening. There
is a major problem which we could get around, but yes.
Right. And someone once told me that it refers to the big Leviathan or something, and that could have been referring to dinosaurs. Fine.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So that's how we think about that question. What about you mentioned the other question is the monkey human question. How do you think about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's important to think about. And this also is based on something that Nachmanides says, is how do we think about man? Okay? So man the rabbis talk about man as like a mix between angels and animals. And it is that man has like a physical body, which he shares with animals, and then he has a divine element, you call it Tzem Elokim, the image of God, or a soul, a neshama, however you want to call it. But there's the non-physical part of man, which differentiates him from the animals. So the Nachmanides says that man, when it says, we shall make man, the verse says, we shall make man, it says it means that man's body was made from the dirt, and then God breathed into him like a spark of the divine. And the idea is that man's body was created in the same way animals' bodies were created, from the physical elements. And that, again, Nachmanides didn't know that, but science tells us that the way animals came into existence and the way man came into existence, our bodies were through a process of evolution. Great, that's the way God created our bodies. But then, 5,700 or so years ago, God breathed into man a spark of divinity and gave us our neshama, our higher element. And the theory of evolution discusses man's body. It doesn't have, the science doesn't have a category of how to think about consciousness and man's higher element. It's an anathema to scientists. How do we even understand consciousness and thought? And we don't understand it. And that's what I would suggest, is that the evolution is totally fine. Man's body is from monkeys, but man's greatness isn't in his body. It's in his divine higher element. And that's not something which evolution has anything to say about. So,
okay. Interesting. All right, I'm trying to think how to use our last few minutes here, because there's a lot of things I still want to ask you. But let me ask you one question first, which is, we've talked about God's role in creation. We've talked about kind of the questions of evolution, and we've talked about fine-tuning and the multiverse. I guess I'll ask both parts of the question. You can address them however you want to address them. I think there's another question that I think raises what happens after creation. So how do we think about God's role? You mentioned the splitting of the sea before, and you mentioned Mount Sinai, those kind of things. How do we approach those questions? And then the second one is I don't want to say it, and I'll just say it, which is so what, right? I think so I think you've laid out beautifully a scientific approach to understanding that God made the world. Maybe you'll say a little bit about God's presence in the world post that creation. We have this beautiful book, which we might not get to, around your mother's, letter about how to be happy in the face of adversity. What does it mean to practically carry this knowledge of God into today's world, and how does that shape who we are? Okay,
great.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question was? How does that
God after creation, God in history, and the second one is, how does knowledge of God affect
us? Okay.
Yeah, or affect you. If you can start with. Let's keep it simple.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So starting with after, I feel it's this in physics to God, we're specifically talking about the existence of God who created the universe, intelligently caused the universe. We're not talking about divine providence. We're not talking about reward and punishment. We're not talking about miracles. We're saying science leads to the conclusion that God exists and God created the universe, which man is part of that universe. And that's a major step. Imagine you could convince all scientists that there's a God who intelligently designed their universe. That's a foundation, and that's a foundation of religion. There are people who would say, they could accept the Torah, but they can't wrap their head around God. So the idea is that this evidence, fine-tuning, shows the existence of God. It doesn't show divine providence. There are other routes to be able to discover that God exists. There's historical arguments that lead one towards the knowledge that the Torah was given to us. That God, and this is again not from the science itself, but God created the world, and man is part of the design. And this is what we believe, we maintain, based upon not from this fine-tuning, but man is part of the divine plan. And he created us in a way that we could know God and have a relationship with God and live meaningful and happy lives centered around knowing God and following in his ways of righteousness and kindness. And so that's so I'd say is that this argument is representing doesn't lead us to the conclusions of Torah, but it leads us to the foundation of everything about the Torah.
Okay, so we keep those separate. There's a nice sense that it seems important that God should exist before we could think about the Torah piece of it. And the Torah piece is not proven by science, it's proven by history.
Yes, but science does leave opening. If God created the universe, and the laws of the universe are a reflection of his will, well then he could override them temporarily to save the Jews from being killed by the evil Egyptians.
Right.
So the idea is that the idea of a God who created the universe paves the road for everything else in the Torah.
Got it. Okay. If God can fine-tune the original numbers in theory, God can intercede in some way.
Yeah, temporarily intercede in them to bring about his bigger picture will to lead the Jewish people towards a good life, and which will show the rest of the world about knowledge of God.
Right. I'll say even for me personally, I experience a lot of godliness in the seeming coincidences of the world. Right. That the chances of this thing happening in this way, someone needs to be pulling strings back there somewhere. But I imagine compared to what we're talking about, that's like a 1 in a million thing or a 1 in a few million, and you're talking about things that are 1 in many billions coincidences.
The laws of the universe, the fine-tuning is by chance alone, it's 1 in a billion trillion.
Right.
And therefore when we see anything we see in our universe, when we get down to it and we study what ultimately causes it, you'll get down to these laws of general relativity, quantum mechanics, which is ultimately based upon these numbers, these laws being perfectly designed and fine-tuned, points directly to God. And everywhere we look, we can see the hand of God, we see the wisdom of God. The more we get down to the science, the more we see God's wisdom and unbelievable design in everything we see.
Right, so let's go to that for a second at the end. So I asked how does this shape your life, right? So one thing is okay, if I believe in God exists, I should take the Torah seriously, let's say, and follow it. But is there another element, you're studying all these numbers, but when you are out in the world, when you are gazing at the sky, when you are noticing a pattern in a sunflower, what's going on for you there?
Right, so I guess I would say is that through the Torah we know that when God designed the universe, man was part of his plan. There was part of the purpose was not just to create a solar system and not just to create our galaxies, but is to create man. And man is part of the divine plan. And I view myself from that place. And I'm part of God's picture. He created mankind and gave us a mission to be able to live a life of service of him and a life of kindness and justice and morality. And I see me as one small part of God's big picture. And I view everything I do from that vantage point. And I relate to other people as also creatures of God who are pursuing a life built around, centered around the source of it all, the God who created it all. And I view my life. And I think there's something about that which in modern society, there's this malaise of emptiness in people's lives, and they feel like there's no purpose, no reason, no rhyme or reason. The scientific worldview is sometimes depressing, if you will. And I feel like this shows us, Torah shows us, and then this argument shows us that we are part of a divine plan, and we fit into the bigger picture, and we could view ourselves as something, energizing about it, looking at your own life as not as small about the small little things we're involved in, but we're part of a bigger picture. We're part of some divine purpose, and we fit into God's plan. And that's, gives me inspiration to, every day, whatever we do in my life. That's
beautiful. All right. We're basically out of time. What I want to do, I'm going to try to do this myself, is say a word about both of these books before we run out of time. You know them better than I do, but I know if I ask you, we won't have enough time. So I'll just say, I think one of the beautiful things that's come from this book, Gematria Refigured, from what I saw, is right. We've talked about science now. I think you've done something here, which is approach, our rabbinic texts and say the idea of gematria, of using numbers to understand words and numbers to symbolize words. We had someone named Gila Fine on, a few months ago, and she talked about how using kind of the lens of literature to approach Gemara is a way to unpack what the Talmud is saying. They're actually using literary tools. And I think I hear you saying here, another tool among the insane number of tools that rabbis use in Gemara is the idea of using numbers not haphazardly, but using them in a way that actually no, we had to explain it using numbers because the thing we're trying to teach is numbers related. Is that fair?
Yes.
So I think if people are interested in that, make sure you check out Gematria Refigured. And then if you somehow made it to the end of this interview and you wanted something totally different that was not science or math based, and you wanted some real Torah from a mother to her son and his interpretation of it around how to have happiness in day-to-day life in the face of adversity, and kind of almost I think of the letter to I guess Ramban's letter to his son. This is another amazing sefer, totally different from everything we discussed today. Happiness in the face of adversity, which is beautiful as well. I'm sorry we didn't get to both of them. Hopefully we'll have you back and go a little bit deeper. But I just want to say I learned a ton. I certainly didn't know the phrase fine-tuning before we sat down just now. And the multiverse was something that I saw in a lot of sci-fi movies. That seemed really cool. And now I hear some Torah around it. I'll ask you one last question just for long term. If the multiverse is proven to be true in 100 years, 200 years, does that mean that God doesn't exist, or we'll have new information then that maybe God still exists despite the multiverse?
It would depend on what a multiverse would mean.
What it means.
A random multiverse, then that would make God kind of moot. But,
right. Unless God intelligently wanted something very random.
Yeah, right.
Hard, but that's not the God that you would want to believe in. I agree.
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Sure, it's been a pleasure, Justin.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Ay, ay, ay,